the canon of literature that exists prior to what Harold Bloom termed the School of Resentment, that's there's an interesting way to go about looking at that world, because there's an association of upper class sort of high art, which alienates those who don't receive the proper education in order to appreciate it. There's implication out there that the average person wouldn't be able to appreciate D.H. Lawrence or Forster or 19th century literature, poetry, Coleridge, Keats, Byron, without a proper education. You know, it's not as quick or intuitive for appreciation as regular old popular culture. It's a weird sort of claim. I frankly think this has more to do with, obviously, times changing, and so one needing some historical context in order to appreciate certain works of art sometimes. Although I am of the opinion, I mean, literature is something which is literature might lend itself to more education, perhaps on history, language, whatever you want to name. But even I certainly think the visual arts, cinema, music doesn't necessarily require education in order to appreciate it. But anyway, this film is about literature, obviously, and often I think it is a thing that people feel alienated by that great body of male logocentric, phallogocentric, as Derrida has apparently put it, that world of the canon of English language, art and literature. This film is about that sort of impasse. It's also about, I guess, drawing from that, why people want to leave what's known as considered the working class, and what they see as appealing about that kind of more prestigious posh world. And I found Educating Rita quite interesting in that it didn't glorify a working class life. I don't know where this film's artist, the writer of the script, it's initially based off of a play they adapted into a screenplay directed by Gilbert. I'm not sure if this was coming from a place of a working class dreamer, or so to speak, or someone from the upper class who was trying to understand or middle class, or to understand what a lower income life would have been like. I'm not sure if this would be seen as like a needless demonization, or a kind of more honest depiction of how, no, it ought not to be romanticized. Life in certain conditions is hell. It reminds me personally of what I found appealing about. I mean, I didn't live in squalor by any means, but I was in an upper middle class suburb on the edges of what's known as Western Sydney, and there's a lot of the people in my primary and high school were generally of a more middle class persuasion, and the appeal of a kind of going to university and UCID and experiencing this kind of canon of body of work and becoming more sophisticated or posh or whatever. The appeal at that time was to, I guess, escape from a world that seemed more, and was in some degrees, to be fair, like vulgar, kind of crass, and just disinterested in life, and very cynical, and kind of glorying in the ugliness of the world, almost in a kind of shock value contrast to the more polished and proper of society. And whilst I would never disagree there was a certain degree of snobbery in the world, in those quarters, it didn't seem to me indicative of much of it, and certainly my time at university was overwhelmingly positive. And I think a film like Educating Rita, it's nice that it demonstrates that there is a sincere appeal in wanting this sort of education that isn't bound to. For Rita, it's not about clout. She wants to be happier. I think that's the fundamentally interesting thing about what resonates, at least for me viewing Educating Rita, is it was, certainly for myself, it was about wanting a happier, more free and euphoric existence, as that sort of university lifestyle seemed to me, and is to some degree up my alley. I prefer the more kind of independent bloggy approach now, but that just is what it is. The reason, initially I was at university because, I divulge a little bit, I wanted a job in academia, and the reason I did was because I figured it would be an easy paycheck. You know, I could just talk about the things that I love and get paid for it. You know, essentially like what a lot of YouTubers want to do now. But I don't expect to get paid from what I do here. I don't think it's worth people donating money to what I do here. Frankly, it's just blogging. You know, whatever. And so ultimately, I realized that in order to really ingrain myself in academia, I needed to write to these set standards, you know, write with this language and about literature or about film in manners that just didn't remotely interest me. It made me depressed, and it felt like it was stifling having to write about why a certain academics, you know, who's designed the course vision of interpreting or reading film is the best one. And I have to admit, I'm not very fond of the more modern academic author is dead approach, where we kind of condescend the artist and talk about why in our modern society we're so much above the times with which the author published their work. I mean, like it just seems like these are just obvious things which seem like a waste of time to base a literary course around. Like, yeah, times change, you know, for the better. It's always seemed to me that I was more interested in a course I took that was very memorable too. I will mention one before the other. The Mark Davidis art history course, if that's still going, I would recommend anyone who happens to be in Sydney to just, here's the thing, you can attend the campus and you can just walk into the lecture hall, like, no, it's perfectly allowed, and you can just find out the schedule with, even when Mark Davidis is still doing his art history lectures, you know, history of Western art essentially, in the first semester of a year, and that is a glorious, phenomenal trip. And I'd also recommend Nick Reimer's his linguistics course, particularly the early portion of it, wherein it goes through the very basics of language, linguistics as a discipline, then the history of the English language itself. That, and you know, we go through the emphasis on meter and poetry and a lot of the interesting things which make language a discipline worth studying. That before it got in too deep and kind of intense for myself, as I was kind of only had a very cursory interest in the discipline and didn't really intend to take it up. Before that, and the primer, courtesy of the head of that, the architect of that course, was one Nick Reimer. Absolutely extraordinary. That's one of the most. It was such a valuable education, that particular, both those courses. But I'd wished, especially for Nick Reimer, it's the same thing where I wished that had been taught to all high schoolers. Certainly when I was in high school, I would have loved that. So educating Rita is partly about the appeal to travel to that sort of world, and it's also about the folly between academic writing versus honest writing. There is a certain degree to which academia can bludgeon, in a good way, the editorializing out of one's work, and it almost becomes like you're writing art as though it's the equivalent of a scientific paper. I find this approach interesting. I like the seriousness of it, and I love sometimes I like the constraints and where it can take you when you're forced to use your imagination and really justify your take on some piece of art, some work of culture, some film, whatever. What I don't like is having to footnote, like you have to use a DVD timestamp to justify, you know, which where in the film this took place, and you have to like I need to prove to you, like I'm on trial here, like I need to prove to you that the film did that. It's like, you saw it, you read my sentence, you agree or you don't agree. Like, to me, it just seemed like we were being pretentious in trying to turn art appreciation, film appreciation certainly, into this kind of nonsense discipline as though it was a science or something. To me, this is the world of critics and filmmakers, frankly. It just seems it's not a discipline. Whilst I do appreciate the old institutions of film criticism to some degree, and the reason I do is because it's better than the kind of film Twitter approach now, wherein people just have garbage writing and it's all about, you know, just having the, you know, trendy takes or whatever, and then like saying some pseudo-witty garbage rather on Twitter. No one should be on Twitter. That's just ridiculous. Come on. But there is a certain... Honest writing is one thing, but it's alienating. Very academic and concise writing, or at least, like, to me, like, my standard of academic writing is like, you know, just if you're writing reviews as carefully as Noel Oakeshott, which I rarely do, as it were, that to me is really good, precise academic writing. I think when Oakeshott writes, he's coming at it as like a kind of from an engineering point of view. He's looking at it from history and what each piece of culture is kind of innovating in the timeline of human technology. Very brilliant writer. There's a tension I feel between academic writing and honest writing, although I can't help but feel that there's a certain safety in the prisons of academic writing, sometimes, to some degree. I feel probably similarly to how Fisher/K-Punk spilled about this prior on his blog and elsewhere. Oh, Educating Rita. I actually don't think it's that great a film. I'm not really interested in... It's kind of a caricature of class relationship, really. But what I find it interesting as a cultural artifact. I am going to be the hypocritically, the pompous kind of, not, you know, dismissing the author and looking at it as a product of the times and how we interpret this as a demonstration of past values and blah, blah, blah. Well, I'm going to do that here, as silly as it might sound. I like how it demonstrates perspectives on what class pathos is, and you know what it's almost describing like different dimensions that one's, you know, transcending through. It's such a palpable acknowledgement of class, but almost to the point of you know, rather than awareness of nihilism and cynicism, you know, to the kind of morbid inevitability. There's this sort of implication that, oh, like, you know, the one isn't, you know, the upper class is just, you know, this inundation and fake, and then, you know, it's all just... There's almost a claim that it's all Emperor's New Clothes, and that one has to don those clothes in order to truly appreciate Forster and Percy Shelley and the like. Obviously, it's more about individuals and, you know, them trying to get from A to B and not really perhaps realizing the substance of what they want, you know. Perhaps Rita wanted to be happy rather than educated. It's just she decided that she felt as though being educated meant acting a certain way, and that would lead to her being happy, and she saw the people who she perceived as happy acting a certain way, and so she acted that way and perceived herself as educated. She thought they were educated, and then it becomes an act of class condescension, perhaps, from the author's part. I'm not sure. I happened to first view this film in my first year of university, and so I will never forget Educating Rita. I don't consider it a really great film, although I find it, yeah, as I said, a very fascinating cultural artifact, to be sure.